All right, looks like we're live. All right, well, so today I want to welcome Eileen Uchitelle and Jeremy Kemper. Both of them work at Basecamp.com, and both of them are contributors to Ruby on Rails, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about what's coming up in Rails 4.2. Do you guys want to introduce yourself maybe a little bit more in depth than that, and then go ahead and get us started?
Sure. Not sure what to say. I'm Eileen Uchitelle. I live in upstate New York, not the city. So we have trees and mountains instead of big buildings. Been working with Rails as like a language for like 5 years, and just started contributing to the source code in like 6 months ago. And that's how much more.
I'm Jeremy at Basecamp and Rails for a while. Been going through beta process with Rails 4.2 for what seems like forever. I was realizing that Rails 4.1 was released almost a year ago, and I had the idea of kind of a quick turnaround on Rails releases every 6 months. Seemed like kind of long, but when it actually comes to upgrading apps at that frequency, that's really soon. And you think of like all the effort that goes into it. And as we've gone through this beta process, Eileen and I were just talking a second ago about like the stability changes, like the things that have changed in Rails and what apps expect out of them. It used to be that Rails could kind of run like fast and loose quite a bit, like introduce new things because it was worth it. You were there with your app, you were working on a new app, doing something new with Rails, and you were there with the new version of Rails. So the idea of going from Rails, or most people going to Rails 4.2 would already be on Rails 4.1. And I'm not even sure right now like what the distribution of Rails versions looks like. But that expectation that we used to be able to have, that people are always keeping up with the latest. We're very much like in legacy land now. Like people are on Rails 3.2, people are on Rails 4.0, and a whole combination of things. So we have this long process now of kind of like an alpha series asking people to preview their apps on a new Rails, and then go through this long beta series where every single possible thing, regression, like missed expectation, little thing that you could possibly stub your toe on comes up, and release a beta, and you stub your toe again, release another beta, stub another toe. And so that this is now the new normal, that we could release Rails 4.1 almost a year ago and then go through months of betas and soon release candidates. And discovering that stability ends up being one of the major features of Rails, despite its colorful reputation for instability in some cases. So do you want to get into the actual things that are in Rails 4.2?
Please.
Eileen, you want to start?
I'm muted. It's gonna go great. Well, let's see. One of the biggest things in Rails 4 is, well, one of the biggest things that you won't see, like code-wise necessarily, is adequate record. Aaron Patterson sped up find and find by methods in active record by two times, made them 2 times faster. This works by caching the SQL queries and the fragments that each of the calls use. So the first time you call find, it's not cached, but then the second time you call find for the second record, it is cached, so it takes a lot less time to find that record in the database.
One thing that I was wondering, like, as Aaron was working on adequate record, as it was getting to this kind of like prototypical stage where it starts deserving a name of its own, like this is adequate record, that there's and active record is doing a lot of work all the time, when you write a chain of some root object and association and scope, every time that runs, it's building up a whole concept of its universe, figuring out how these things are related, scoping them, applying conditions, building up an AST representing all of that, and then walking the AST and generating SQL. So generating a string with specific values for however you happen to call it that one time, and then taking that string and sending it to the database and throwing away all the work it did. So it seems, it's the kind of thing where you can look at any software system from the outside and being like, well, why don't you just X, Y, Z? And that's kind of what adequate record's like. Like, it's a series of why don't you just take into their logical, like, very yak-shavy conclusion of, well, maybe we should just. And when you make that chain, you're building up a relation. Like, what really changes about it? Well, it turns out that the root object has a foreign key that you're referencing, and so you need to be using bind variables or prepared statements, some way of getting that statement separate from the thing that you're binding to it, which itself was an enormous multi-month yak shave that made all of adequate record really possible. And that's why it's scoped to very specific things like Aaron targeted find by something, because it's easy to know the other some things that can affect the result of that query. So there are things like a scope that might be applied if you're saying something with scope. You need to know that that scope exists because you wouldn't want to use the cached relation or the cached query that doesn't take that scope into account. So there's a lot of room for kind of adequate plus plus that knows about all the other things that could come into play and like transparently caches the relation or the prepared statement for all those possibilities. But as one of the things that we saw from adequate record is that it causes a new kind of class of problems. If you start caching prepared statements for all the stuff you do, if you do a bunch of stuff, now you've got tons of prepared statements floating around your database. So there's some trade-off, and you speed things up and you improve things from the application's point of view, but we have unintended consequences that create new kinds of brittleness. And definitely a net win, but also adequate.
So I have to ask, I'm going to break in here for a second. Is this something we're going to get for free in Rails 4.2? We don't have to do anything, we just keep doing the find and find by queries that we would normally do?
Yep, you don't have to do any work on the application side to get those to work.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a mixed bag because it's sweet that you don't have to do anything, but it also kind of sucks that you don't know when it's working, when you're adequate. Like there's not like a light that turns on that's like, cha-ching, got my adequate speed. That you're not going to do any worse. Like the best you can do is like it's going to help.
The same.
But if you wanted to do something like like profile-driven optimization, like figure out are there spots where I could be taking advantage or adequate could be helping me, but I'm doing something else that's preventing it from doing so. So it's kind of tough. Like it's something that's a win, and you could tell like in your aggregate results. Like if you're looking at performance data in whatever tool you use, then you'd see that query times have gone down, or your action times have gone down. But it can be hard to attribute it then to say like that's adequate, thank you adequate, versus thank you something else.
Yep. Although it should be noted that the adequate record doesn't apply to models that use a default scope. So if you have a default scope and then use find and expect those to work together, that's not going to happen. Or models with single table inheritance.
There are things that it totally could do, and adequate to.
Yep.
Return of enough.
But if you look at like the diff from all of the work that Aaron did, it's kind of insane. Like it's a lot of work to like spend many months working on like the same part of active record trying to get it to work. and just like moving these like little methods around and like rewriting things so that it's faster for everybody.
So there is a question in the chat, and that is there a way to see if it's returning from the cache or executing the query?
I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure if we indicate that, because one of the things that makes that kind of tricky is that in the end you're going to get the same query, and so it's building the same SQL statement, and if it happens to be that the relation or the prepared statement was cached, if you're still going to see that same statement going into the in the logs. That's a good idea. We should annotate the logs so you know.
You were inadequate. You'll be adequate next time.
Very adequate.
Well, it was
that's another thing with the gotchas, like default scope. It'd be really nice to know, like, if you weren't adequate, why? What's the thing that kicked in that knocked you out of the kind of the sweet spot? And if you look at the code, that was one of the more enjoyable things about one of the diffs. It was the guard statement at the beginning of this code that's checking to see whether you can be adequate, and it's this whole sequence of like, not this, not this, not this. Oh no, not that either. Oh nope, nope, nope. So it's all the special cases of things that could, their dynamic behavior that would be very difficult to end up accounting in some kind of cache key to figure out which statement to use. Where you get into a situation where figuring out the cache key and building it is itself an expensive operation. So instead, you kind of bypass a bunch of complex scenarios and just focus on the simple ones. There's some other active record improvements that I class kind of along with adequate record, like the change to dirty tracking. That's something that's hit a lot of people over the years, where if you use a serialized attribute, or if you use composed of, if you do anything where you have an attribute that you might want to make in-place changes to, like if you're serializing a hash and then you just write something directly to the hash, then Active Record would always write that attribute back to the database, because it couldn't really tell whether it changed unless you told it. So there's a set of methods called the dirty methods, where you have like attribute underscore changed question mark, and so you could ask whether an attribute changed. And that's something that works for your normal primitive types like string and integers and whatnot. But as soon as you serialize something, for Active Record to be able to track that, it would need to snapshot the initial value, and then when it's saved again, it would need to serialize it and compare. And it was deemed that the cost of snapshotting would be too high, because essentially, like when you load any record, so you load some big collection, and now you're making a copy of everything. And the only way to avoid that would be to track mutable changes to those data structures, which is itself a giant mess and causes other kinds of problems. So now dirty tracking is doing the snapshot comparison. So it's a kind of thing that's behind the scenes, like you won't notice. It just means that if Active Record can detect that your serialized object did not change, it's not going to send it back to the database. So if you do something like a big text blob of JSON, and you change some other field, it's not going to do a giant JSON update for everything you do on that field or everything you do on that record. So that's also kind of like an adequate thing that you wouldn't really know that's happening, and you probably won't notice. Like your tests should still be green. It'll just cause fewer headaches in the future for folks who try to make modifications to serialized fields or something that's mutable and hit some kind of like funky situation or unexpected result. Active Record's doing a little bit more to watch your back. And cover the new things in Active Record?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's see. One of the things is something that I actually changed when you did a delete all or an update all with a collection proxy, actually this was one of my first commits. I actually did a talk about it, thinking it wasn't a bug, which is how I ended up started working on Rails because Aaron was like, no, that is totally a bug. So delete all and update all when you had, like when you were deleting records through an association. So if you have a category and categorizations and you were doing a delete all on that, instead of just deleting it like normal with the foreign key, it would actually like do a crazy in statement where it did delete from categorizations where the category ID is equal to 1 and the categorizations ID is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I would just like go on and on and on. That was completely unnecessary and was actually just a bad if statement or a bad conditional in active record that wasn't taking that delete all into consideration, and it was falling into the destroy category and then going through other like crazy stuff where it's a long explanation. But so it doesn't do that anymore, and now it just does a really simple, quick, less than a second delete statement where it just deletes them all at once. Delete all from categorizations where categorizations category ID is 1, and then you're just done. Let's see.
I feel like that's a lot of the changes to active record. So there are a lot of, or there's a lot of complexity that comes from having all these dimensions of features, like the way that associations can interact and scopes can interact with them. And then things get chained. So you're asking something of a relation, and the way that you answer it itself is special case depending on whether it's loaded or not.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing that's asking for complexity, and sure enough, there is. And a lot of pull requests are discovering some kind of, like, this seems kind of funky, odd, like, not sure whether it's quite wrong, but it definitely doesn't seem right. And then that's like the entree into digging into how active record works. And I enjoy seeing that. Like, I was looking through a bunch of the contributions between 4.1 and 4.2, and tons of them are people who've made one contribution ever, but the one contribution is pretty significant. It was like a lot of troubleshooting and figuring stuff out. And I think that's just fascinating that people will get into open source that way. Like, some naughty little problem, and it just untying it is itself like a whole adventure, and it fixes like one little bug. And the one little bug is, this larger landscape of like different dimensions of behavior that active record exposes. And it's really cool. I think on the scope of like bigger features in active record, one of the ones that still seems new to me and kept kind of coming back in my head when I was thinking of new things in 4.2 was enums, enumerations, which were actually Rails 4.1. So I don't know how many folks who are watching, like, what Rails version you're on, kind of what your context is or mental state for like what Rails does. But that one still kind of feels new to me because like I don't reach for it when I'm working on something new yet. It's something that grew out of like seeing the same kind of boilerplate repeated again and again in applications, where you've got something that pulls from some set of values, and so having those values enumerated in a way is just useful. And getting the convenience methods to go along with them. So if you have something like a job status, and that's a typical one, like it's pending or it's in process, it's active or it's completed, then you get query methods along with it, predicate methods. Another one that has been a long time coming and has a long history is foreign key constraints. So it's something that active record has long done. Like, you don't need a constraint to be a foreign key. The constraint is just what makes it special and what makes it maintains consistency in the database. So you can add foreign key constraints now in migrations, and there's a little bit of shorthand also when you say like T references and then a column name. You can say what type of reference that is. So you can say like it's a UUID reference, and that'll create the foreign key constraint for you. And you can also declare the foreign key constraint directly. So that's something that most people won't do, but it's the kind of thing that folks who have been using Active Record for a long time and who have been possibly doing it by hand. It's just something that's possible now. That's kind of a little bit of a philosophical change that's gradually happened as Rails has gotten older and has worked with more stable applications. Like as you've seen Rails 4 and Rails 4.1, there were a lot of things added for Postgres in particular. And it's not out of a specific preference for Postgres. It's because there are Postgres users who wanted to use those things and wanted to have their schema dumped in schema.rb and wanted to use them in migrations and just wanted the full kind of coherent Rails experience using those specific things. And to the point where we're happy to like make those kinds of things possible. So if anybody wants to come along and do that kind of thing with MySQL or SQLite or whatever else, by all means, go for it. But foreign key constraints are just like that. I mean, that's something that's it's hard to make a strong stand one way or another. Like having a constraint is itself like inherently correct. It depends on the kind of characteristics you're looking for, and of course, active record associations are built on the idea of foreign keys, so that's nothing that's unfamiliar to people. But now, if you want to add those constraints yourself in migrations, then now you have convenient Ruby methods to do it. Tag, you're it.
Do you want to do more active record? Just looking through my notes. There's so many like little things that I don't know if they're interesting. We added a bin rake db purge task. That's probably not that exciting, but could be very useful. That it empties the database for the current environment that you're using. So instead of just dropping the entire, I think it's instead of dropping the entire thing.
I did not know about that. So it deletes all the data from the tables rather than dropping all the tables?
Yep.
Dropping the whole database?
Yeah. It just purges the data. So it can be useful for if you want to keep your table, but you don't, like if you don't want to drop your entire table just to like have it empty, or I mean your entire database just to have it empty, you could keep your tables and then just restart with no data. Which could be useful.
Today I learned.
Well,
I'm trying to keep the interruptions to a minimum, but my kids are going to keep running in and out because they scheduled my wife to have surgery on her finger today, and she's not here. So just a heads up. If you see kids run in and out, just ignore them.
Best of luck to her. Well, we could go on to other big things in 4.2 because there are some big new things.
As much as I only work on active record, really, there are other parts of Rails, I think.
Oh, really?
And there's a new part, which isn't really a new part. It's a new thing that encompasses an old part of most apps, active job. There's the idea behind
that. You want to dig in?
Well, so there's this whole idea of like having a queue abstraction. I think it was in Rails 4.0 or 4.1. But this idea that you'd have like a message queue and you'd be able to push things on it and kind of get things on it. And it's kind of hand wavy and had a bunch of code written. And the code was all good and worked. But the way that it was exposed to apps was just kind of awkward because you think in terms of like a message queue and like putting messages on a queue, which just didn't really jibe with the way that we used jobs in our apps. And so took a step back and we essentially nixed that effort and say let's take another go at it later. And one thing we noticed was that in most of our apps, we were coming up with a similar kind of like high-level abstraction as what eventually ended up in active job, just like a job superclass that wrapped up a lot of the common things that you do in a job, like the idea of like being able to assign it to certain workers. And one thing we noticed is that we had kind of got like mentally gotten this bug of like thinking of everything about jobs in terms of queues and messages, when really queues and messages are kind of like an implementation detail. And it's really that you have a job, you need something done, and you have a schedule for it. And typically your schedule is just kind of implied, like as soon as possible, like just get it done for me. And sometimes you have, well, so let's say you start with that. Say you start with like, I've got these jobs, I'm just like, here, I've got to get this stuff done, figure it out. And one of the things you'll discover using most job queue systems is that they introduce the idea of priority, because if say that you have some bulk activity, like at midnight you bring in a bunch of data from somewhere and you queue up a bunch of jobs to process it, and it turns out you're also trying to say send email in the background or send an SMS to somebody in a job, then now that high priority job is now competing with your bulk jobs. And so most things will come up with some kind of facility for dealing with that there are different classes of priority. And that a bulk job, you're really saying like, I just need this done sometime. I'm scheduling this to be done. Whereas sending an SMS that needs a response, you're saying like, I need this done now. Or in some cases that might be like, I'm putting this in the high priority queue. Or it could be like Unix process scheduling, where you'd say like, this has a default kind of nice level, but I can nice it up and down to change its preference for getting CPU time, because this needs to finish faster, or this is intensive and I don't want it to be horning in on other stuff. But ultimately, the thing that the application is concerned with is, this is what the job is, here's its behavior, like here's how it runs. And it just needs to run someplace else, and I need to be able to tell whether it's some bulk thing or an immediate thing, like a later thing or a now thing. And that's something that most backends deal with in one form or another. So we took a step back and represented the idea of the job itself as the thing that matters to Rails apps, and not the queue. And rather than trying to come up with like a queue idea that then we'd plug in adapters to other backend messaging systems, instead we took it up a level of abstraction. And you worry about the job, and we plug into existing queuing systems. So trying to work with all the existing tools that everybody uses as much as possible. Like that was a big thing too, that most people already do background jobs in one form or another. Like conceptually, it exists, and whether you're using Rescue to do it or Beanstalk or whatever, your app probably already has that. And so moving to Rails 4.2, you can still keep using all the same stuff, but you're free to start doing new work using the job abstraction, and just putting that job abstraction around the code that executes, and then plugging it into your existing queues. So you can feed your jobs to the same backends that you already use. You can use the same worker infrastructure that you already use. But for new things you do, you have a simple, coherent, uniform API for saying, how do I run this job, and how do I perform it later? So what you'll see in new apps, there's an app jobs directory, and you can generate jobs, you can test jobs. It has the full, up and down vertical swath of just like models or controllers or any other first-class part of the application. So that's another big thing. It's just giving them a place. A place for things is a big part of, it's a big feature of Rails, that there's a clear place for something like that to go, and you don't need to invent it every time. So when you're generating a new app or you're upgrading an app, now Rails knows about this kind of thing that you do. And it's got all the same tools you'd expect for any other first-class part of Rails.
And one of the nice features that comes with it is a global ID. So you no longer have to just like, usually when you make a Java, you have to pass just the ID of the object and then get it back from the database. Now with global ID, you just pass it the object and it will serialize it for you and then deserialize it when it needs to. And you don't need to like deal with just sending the ID and then looking it up in the database and doing like multiple database calls just to get like your object into the queue.
Yeah, one thing we see in like pretty much every job, like the first thing you do is you've got some primitive like an ID or some identifier. First thing you do is look it up, and then you do all the stuff with the thing you looked up. It's like saying that again and again and again and again and again. It's like, well, maybe we should represent that thing that we're passing as an identifier, just in a more standardized way, and then do the lookup so that boilerplate isn't repeated. So that's where global ID came. Oh, that was its genesis. Like, wanted to be able to do something like that. But you can use it for all kinds of other stuff too. You can use it as, it's kind of like a, well, it literally is a URI. So it's a uniform way of identifying a record, and it uses its own little URI scheme. So you can do things like, it's kind of like if you think about like a polymorphic association where you've got to type in an ID, and that's enough to be able to uniquely identify something in the database because you know with its type, you know where to go, which table to go find it in. So similarly, just referring to something by, here's the model, here's the class name, and here's its ID. And when I want to go locate it, I've got the class and ID. I'll just look it up. So you can use it in things like an API. You can use it in a signed cookie if you want to reference an entity rather than having to have a compound reference. It's just a way of compounding that reference for you so you have a single value. And there's a little bit of help too for in cases where you might want to pass a reference like that publicly. Say, so if you have something in a cookie, the cookie itself is signed, and so you're sure that it's not going to be tampered with. And global IDs have a little bit of a convenience to do the same thing. So you can sign the global ID value itself, and it gets a nice little envelope around it that says, here's my contents, and here's a signature validating that that my contents haven't been changed. And so when we want to go look up the original record, we can validate the signature, check that we can verify it, so nobody mucked around with it, and then look it up. So little things that like actually that ends up could be an interesting feature in your apps that is driven by something that Rails wanted to be able to do internally as a convenience for all apps. But it turns out like we've been putting it into Basecamp in a bunch of spots where it's like we're doing all this work here, we could just take all that out and use a global ID. The other kind of add-on to ActiveJob is that's built into Action Mailer now too. And so we're deprecating the existing deliver method call and splitting them into deliver now and deliver later. So deliver will keep working, and the nice thing about splitting it is that it's super clear what's happening. So there are certain times when you want to pass something to a mailer, and it relies on, say that you've made some state changes to a record and you haven't saved them, and there's some other kind of in-flight state that you want to be using in an email that you're rendering. Well, you can pass that instance directly to the mailer and say deliver now, and it will literally send the email now. But that's going to change to start encouraging people to deliver later. And that means that when you pass arguments to Action Mailer, if you pass a record to Action Mailer, it's going to turn that into a global ID for you. So it's going to look at the record and say, here's my reference to that record. I'm going to queue up a job to deliver this email later, and I'm going to pass a reference to that record that you're talking about. So if you created a new comment, then you're going to queue a job that's a deliver email later job, and it's going to have a global ID reference to the comment. And behind the scenes, that job is going to look up the comment and call your mailer just as if you had called deliver now.
So one thing that I have to ask really quickly then, on Active Job, you said that you can use whatever infrastructure you're already using on your app, so Rescue or Sidekick or Delay Job or whatever. Is this going to require you then to set up some kind of back-end job system as part of your application in order to make mailers and other things work?
Yes. So if you use Deliver Later, you're going to need a way to do the deliveries later. So I think it'd be really neat to do an in-process backend where it's not really it's not an out-of-process thing. It's not some other thing you run. But it would be perfect for somebody just pushing their first app to Heroku, and you're following a tutorial that's saying deliver later, or following some code you read online, and you push that code into production, and there's no queue hooked up. Well, if there's no queue hooked up, it's going to deliver now. So if there's nothing there, then your kind of no op queue is just your now queue. So it'll still deliver, but I think that's a little bit funky. We had some discussions about what's appropriate in that situation. When you're saying deliver later, delivering now is actually okay, because thinking back to the idea of process scheduling, you have a task and you want it done later, and actually right now is technically later. It just matters that it's happening. But I think that's a little bit misleading too, because when you deliver something later, it implies this step of making the global ID reference, shipping it out of process somewhere, that other, some kind of worker who's going to be responsible for that job is going to look it up and run it. Which you could end up in kind of a funky situation if you do this in development and it's delivering immediately, and then you deploy it to production, it's delivering immediately. Then you introduce a back-end job queue, you use one of the adapters to ship it out of process, and you discover that you're relying on some state in one of the objects that you passed to the mailer, that you lost that state when it gets converted to a reference. So you're referencing the entity, not the specific object, and you're not marshaling the whole object. So you could end up in a situation where you don't detect a bug that you should have detected, and something so in our in tests we work around this, so it's not like you're executing now. It simulates being shipped out of process, so you have a reference that you then look up. So when you're testing to see whether your email was sent and sent correctly, you're going to be testing what production looks like then. But if in production, if you don't have tests, and if in production you're relying on this kind of behavior that happened to work in development also, then you change something and it breaks, boom. That's a pitfall of doing something like this kind of transparent reference, where you could lose state unintentionally.
Oh, so you want to talk about something else, or more on Active Job?
Sure. Active Job is actually, and it's kind of like a little bit anticlimactic. It's a really appropriate time for this kind of thing to exist in Rails, but it's very much not a new thing, and it's Rails recognizing that this is what apps do. And so it's really Rails saying, this is how we build apps, this is how you build apps, this is how we all build apps. And this is the abstraction that we all need, that we're all using already, so let's wrap it up and give it places in the app so it doesn't feel like everybody's having to come up with them every time. So we see kind of a mishmash across many projects where people make their own app directory, they'll put them in models, or they'll divide them along kind of functional boundaries, like, and then it can be hard for folks to go find like where does that behavior live? Where should I be looking? Do I end up like searching through the project or grepping or whatever to figure it out? Oh no, like if it has job at the end of the name, it lives here, and you're going to be able to find it there.
Mm-hmm. Another new feature in Rails 4.2 is Web Console, and it's kind of fun because you can use your console in the browser. So every time you hit an error, you'll have a little console at the bottom, at the bottom of your page, where you can run, change test data, figure out like what went wrong without having to go to your terminal and opening the console. You can also add a console ERB tag in any page and have that open when you go to that page in your browser, as well as you can actually go to /console in your development application and run everything there. Although I kind of prefer the actual terminal console rather than going into the browser, but for people who don't want, maybe if you don't have dual monitors, it'd be easier so you don't have to go into another application to use the console. It comes with some fun little extra configurations that you might not consider that it would come with. You can actually style all of the colors and fonts so that it matches your terminal.
What?
Yeah. And it's a VT100 emulator, so it's got like, you know, this good stuff for fun. And there was a little bit of a security issue with it, so they added the ability to whitelist IPs, so that when you're in development mode, someone can't just like hijack your console and ruin everything.
Well, that actually brings to mind, when I was looking through the changes in 4.2, there are a bunch that fall under this kind of larger umbrella of just development improvements, things that are new and just make like the experience of working with Rails a little bit nicer. And web consoles like that, like if you hit an error, this is web consoles based on Better Errors. It's a plugin that's been around for a long time, and Web Console was a Google summer code project as kind of like a pared down form of Better Errors. And so when you hit an exception, you've got something that pops up and gives you like a place to go, rather than just telling you that something happened or like something blew up. There's an action you can take from there. Like the console's open, and so it's particularly useful for folks who are new to web development or new to the console. Like that's the thing that you open now. Like something's going on. Let's go figure it out. Let's pop open IRB, and that's something that's often not the first thing that somebody who's unfamiliar with popping up the console would do. You're relying on your text editor and kind of like eyeballing things to like figure out where a bug is. When being there in context at the point where an exception occurred and seeing where it occurred can really help resolve misconception about what could be happening, or like why could this, skip the whole like guesswork part or like eyeballing part about looking at the code, and let's look at it actually in execution on the machine and just see what the state looks like. Fix the bug there. I also wouldn't think to bring up the console just because, but having it pop up in response to something, like here was some error that I didn't expect. Oh, it turns out I can just like type here, and I didn't know that I could set the color 0, which is going to make it somehow like way more useful.
Yeah, because otherwise you'd be like, it's white, I don't want to use it, or like it's just boring. It's not my colors. I'm so used to my colors.
Some other little things like that that really help out with development are like config4. It's just a little shortcut on the Rails application object, and you'll probably notice in your applications that if you mirror the way that Rails organizes its configuration, like in database.yaml, you'll have a configuration file that's first organized by environment, and then has kind of a bunch of a hash of stuff, just key value pairs, and in your config initializers, you probably have a config initializer for something with the same name. Like if you're setting up, Memcache or Redis or whatever, you've got an initializer that's for setting up Redis and goes and loads that YAML file, plucks out the little bit for your current environment, and then does maybe symbolizes the keys, and then goes and configures Redis. And we notice that in many files, like every external service or our internal services and APIs, anything that needs to be set up kind of follows the same pattern. And so config4 just takes a symbol name, so config4 Redis, and it'll look for config redis.yaml, and it'll pull out the development config or the production config depending on your environment, and it'll symbolize the keys. So you end up with just, hey, I got my config from somewhere. And the idea behind that is that is another thing that came up in with config secrets. That was a 4.1 feature. And if you're not already using it, config secrets is kind of a conventional place to put things that are sensitive. And the idea is that ultimately you don't check those into source control, so if somebody were to get access to your code, they wouldn't also get access to your databases or your S3 buckets or your customer data, just access to your code. And if you use something like config4, then you're no longer doing things like saying, go load a YAML file from this location. Your app is saying, I just need config for this. And so ultimately you could plug something else into that, like go get config for from an environment variable, from a set of environment variables, go get it from etcd, go get it from a chef data bag. Like, doesn't matter where it exists. As far as the application is concerned, the API it's using is saying, go get config for this from someplace else. It's external. It's not necessarily part of your app checkout or your code.
Also introduced, or was it reintroduced, skip gems? Because I thought that used to be there on the app generator to skip gems like turbo links and coffee rails if you don't want them. That can be useful for, so then you don't have to like go back into your gem file and delete. Like, oh, I don't actually want turbo links. Now I have to go turn them off. If you use the skip gems turbo links command when you generate an app, you won't get any of that extra stuff if you don't want it in there. Was that a reintroduction, or was that? I thought that.
That's actually, there was a little bit of confusion because we have so the generators are built on Thor, and it provides some kind of baked-in options, and then we'd also provide some options, and we get cases where there'd be overlap between them. Like we'd be able to say something like no turbo links, but also be able to say skip gems turbo links. So you get kind of ambiguous situations like, what am I supposed to use to actually do this? And I've never liked those upfront configs for that reason, and for the fact that like you got to know what the config is. Like when you're making an app, like I don't know what all those flags are, and I'm not going to do like whatever -h and then like scour the list and figure it all out. It's just I just want to see, just give me my app, and then I'll kind of I'll spruce it up and move things around a little bit. Templates are really good if you know that, like, if you're somebody who's always creating fresh apps for clients, then you probably already do this. You have a template that reflects like your standard setup, and that standard setup includes things like none of this stuff, all of that stuff, all these gems, none of those gems, blah blah blah. The whole shebang. And then you're saying, when I generate an app, use that template. Because you do it once, and it's not like, oh, dash dash this, dash dash that, dash dash no this with that. Two other dev things that I think were kind of like neat abstract or neat extractions. Another one for config is that you can use config.x.anything now. So one thing that you often see in engines and other things that kind of provide their own Rails features to you is there'll be config dot whatever engine name, and then a bunch of like things you can muck around with from your app. And to set that up, it's not really that big of a deal. An engine will assign an options object or a hash or whatever to config.engineName. But it turns out to be kind of a boilerplate hassle if you want to replicate that in your own app. Because you go try to do it in your app and you'd think like config.whatever would just work, but it doesn't. That actually needs to be set up, and engines do their own setup. And so we made kind of an area that just works the way you'd expect. If you use config.x, it's reminiscent of HTTP headers and other things that are preceded with X to indicate that they're not official, they're not standard, they're not coming from someplace that could collide with other stuff. That's fully your domain. So config.x.anything is up to your app to set things. So you can do things like in an initializer, or say you have shared plugins that you use just for your own internal applications. You can do something like set config.x.mystuff. Some other thing, and then reference it from anywhere else in your app. It's just a little. It's not a huge deal. That just makes that boilerplate part of your app a little bit smaller and a little bit nicer. Similar thing was bin setup. It's something that we've done in our apps for ages, and we heard from a lot of other people doing the same kind of thing with different names, like script bootstrap or script first run or script install. And it's just a file it's an executable that you can run, and to always be sure you get the app working. So a case that we'd be in, it's like we've got a lot of people who work on Basecamp, and not all of them are Ruby programmers. A lot of designers know Ruby really well, but getting everything else set up on the computer is really kind of a pain in the butt. So some people will take the approach of using a VM that you distribute, and everybody just boots the VM. It's great, takes care of all the infrastructure concerns. We don't. And some of the fallout of that is that when you say you get a laptop for the first time and you haven't run an application, well, you get clone. Now what? Like, do you? I guess I look at some files, or like look for a README, or hope somebody kind of says something. Like, you assume you can just start a Rails server, and that will probably work. But there are other dependencies, there are other services that expect to be running, and as soon as you end up with a constellation of apps in any form, you want some standard way of being able to say, start this, and it's going to work. You'll be able to go to this URL, and you'll see your development app. So that could be things like installing software, could be things like starting Foreman for you.
Rebuilding the database.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, get your database seeds in there, and then at the end you have an app that works.
So is this kind of an open format file where, I can make it so that it's just on the first run, or I can make it idempotent so that if there's an update to the overall way that the system works, that I can just run it again and it ignores all the stuff that's already set up? Or is that up to me?
That's up to you.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's something that we strive for idempotence, where you know that, like, if say you've checked out an app and you worked on it months ago, and then a bunch of things have happened, yada yada yada. You come back, you get pull, and there's like all kinds of stuff. Now what? Well, I want to be able to run that again and be sure that it's going to work again. We've thought about doing split scripts, so you have an executable that was like, this is first time thing, this is your first install versus like an update. But it ends up getting confusing, like which to run when, and then there are certain cases where an update doesn't quite do it. Then at some point your update executable ends up being the same as your install, except also checking for idempotence.
So it's just more of a convention saying you have this option, this script that you can run,
Totally.
and know where it is.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
One of the important changes to Actionpack that people are going to want to pay attention to, the filter family of methods is going to be removed and replaced with action. So instead of saying like before underscore filter, it's going to be before action. So that way it's more explicit that it's not really a filter. It's like actually happening before some action that you've set up. So it still works now, but you'll in 5.0 they're going to be switched and filter will no longer work. And that's a good thing that just if you are upgrading to 4.2 to start changing now so that you don't get bit by it.
Just to clarify, those they do the same thing. They're just aliases of each other, right? So you're just removing the one way of calling it.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Another big one for Actionpack is the change in the HTML sanitizer. This is another kind of adequate class thing that a lot of people won't notice at all, and maybe don't do sanitization, so won't notice. Some people will, and especially in tests, because the API changed a little bit for assert select, and that's due to the way that that we read the structure of the response. So assert select used to have some kind of idiosyncratic behavior because we had a vendor built-in HTML document parser, and that switched to Mokugiri, and along with switching to Loofah. It's an external library. You know the Loofah, which I guess I had heard of these things before, like they're little kind of scrubby doodads that go in showers. I didn't know it was a loofah. So as this was being developed, I'm thinking like, what's a loofah? Like, is it some like joke I'm missing? Like loofah? No, it's an actual name for like the shower thing that so you clean yourself with it. So obviously, when you're sanitizing, you're scrubbing your HTML. And so if you use sanitize, like if you take user input as HTML and you want to present it, then you better be sanitizing already. And if you're doing that, then the back end of it's going to change. So this was also a Google Summer of Code project to change out that entire structure, whole back end, and switching to something that's it's robust, new, modern, faster. Excellent use of a Google Summer of Code scope project. The things you'll notice in your tests, if your tests fail, it's probably because you're using a CSS selector that's technically invalid. That's why some of my tests broke. Like there are certain things where you could use a selector without quotes around the value that you're selecting against, and if that breaks, it'll be pretty obvious that this is how to fix it.
One of the kind of like things that you might not even notice, and it's like so small, but truncating words like instead of like just a sentence like on characters is something that they added in Rails 4.2, and I feel like I've written that method like 1,000 times. I actually like wrote it just like a helper and never thought to be like, hey, why don't we just add it to Rails? So now that's in Rails, and you'll truncate your words in a sentence instead of like cutting off the middle of a word.
It's funny, like, so everybody needs to do that, and it's so awkward when you end up in a situation where you've got the like funky truncated ending, and you want to fix it, and like, no, basically got to write your own helper.
Yeah, I've written that helper like a bunch of times. Never occurred to me to be like, hey, let's just add it to Rails. Should have been a pull request a long time ago.
Another development thing. So as we're talking about these, like some things stood out to me with like the kind of pattern of new features being added and what was being worked on. Kind of this adequate class of things is its own whole umbrella of people working on things that you might not notice and are just improving the way the framework works, which improves the way your app works. And it's a recognition of this is like a mature framework. We have legacy apps, we have new apps, but it's improving the way things already are. It's not just pushing things forward. And another thing like that is test order is going to change. For a long time, it's been sorted just for people's convenience, and that's because that's the way test unit used to work. And throughout the years, that default has changed. When Minitest came around, the default eventually changed to shuffling tests. And of course, shuffling tests exposes a bunch of tests that rely on side effects from other tests. So it's something that seems kind of a no-brainer, like we just changed that. And in a past Rails version, we may well have being like, well, things change. Like if your tests break because they don't run in any order, like that's something that was already kind of your bug, But the problem is when you're upgrading to a new version of Rails, one of the first things you do is run your tests. And I expect when I run my tests for it to tell me what breaks about its interaction with new Rails, not to change my expectations about my app, not to make me change my tests before I can understand the interaction with new software. Like, I have a circular problem there of like, I can't trust tests that I need to change to figure out whether I trust the changes, So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of position. So we end up being pretty conservative about this and introducing a new default that's really stating the way things already are, saying that its tests are sorted. But now there's a new configuration where you can say config.activesupport.testorder and set that to random. And it's going to default to random in 5.0. So you've got a full multi-release cycle to update apps and resolve those test failures before upgrading to a new version of Rails and discovering whether or not it works. Something like that it's kind of funny because it seems completely natural to do that long deprecation cycle and be conservative about it, but actually I say that and talk about the background too. It's also kind of silly. Like you should just be able to do that and just maybe like put up a blog post or a tweet or something like, hey, running tests in sorted order might be hiding some broken tests. You might want to fix that. But it's a large software is like a giant megaphone, and the only time people are often seeing stuff like this is after doing a gem upgrade, and running tests. Like, why did this not work? So pointing to something like a release notes or a tweet or something is completely not sufficient. Anything else on the list?
You added something with concerned class methods. I don't know if you want to talk about what you changed there, Jeremy.
Oh yeah. So
I think it was your pull request. Yeah.
One thing that's kind of funky is if when you're in a Ruby block, you can't declare a constant because it's in the context of the outer scope. So one of the conventions for a concern is that the whole idea behind a concern, if you unwrapped it and didn't call it a concern, is that it's really a trait on the class that it's being included in. So if you look at the way that a concern behaves, it's aggregating behavior amongst modules that depend on each other. They depend on, it's not necessarily that there's a direct interface between the modules, but it's a way of aggregating behavior that then applies to a class. And so it's splicing together the idea that you want some class methods as well as instance methods. So it's just a shortcut for something that often happens. And the convention for declaring those class methods is saying module class methods. The problem with that is that that's Ruby syntax that's declaring a new constant, And if you're doing it within a concerning block, it's not going to work because it will be actually making a class methods constant in the scope of whatever else you're in the class you're in or in the top level. So there's just a convenience method for saying class methods do, and then your stuff now. And that will declare a module for you without mucking with the constant namespace. It's a little bit clearer too, rather than saying like module yada yada yada, where you kind of have to know like you need to use that particular Ruby syntax versus like I'm in the context of a concern, like I'm aggregating things that are going to go on to a class. So I want to use methods that reflect that. There's another one you were reminding me of that was it the e-tag?
Oh, change? Yeah. I think that was you too. One of your pull requests. Template digest will now automatically include e-tags and make it easier to HTTP cache your actions.
So this is also, I put that under the adequate umbrella too, because it's something that most people wouldn't really notice, and it's actually a bug in most people's apps who use cache freshness headers on rendered HTML. If you consider the case where somebody's browsing your site and they get a cache freshness header back, like they're using an e-tag validator, the browser stores that validator for you, and then you deploy a design change to that page or to a partial that's rendered on that page. Person comes back and reloads their page. The browser sends the e-tag saying, only send me a response if none match. If there's nothing that validates matching my entity tag. The Rails app sees that entity tag and is like, well, let's see here. I'm saying if stale with an e-tag of just the record, or just the record and some other thing. And so my e-tag is only going to my e-tag is too permissive. My e-tag saying like if this record ever changes, do something. But of course there are other things that change. It's not just the resource. That's essentially what saying if stale some record name is representing, that your resource has some cache freshness. But the thing that you're working with is the representation, the HTML that you're rendering, the JSON, whatever else, you're showing a representation of that resource. And if you change the representation, you really want your cache freshness information to change also. So in this case, if you're changing your HTML templates, or if you're using JBuilder templates to return JSON, we have digests for the templates themselves that we will automatically incorporate into the e-tag. So as soon as you start using a cache freshness check in an action, it'll automatically pick up and include the digest for the template you would have rendered. So if you change the template, it'll change the e-tag for the representation you return. There's a subtle gotcha with this too, that means that you'll actually blow browser cache when you deploy Rails 4.2 for the first time. So if you have a bunch of browsers with a hot cache, and you deploy Rails 4.2, and your app heavily relies on like heavily cached resources, like if it's costly to render. So this will affect some apps, not most. Then your e-tags are going to change because they're now going to incorporate the digest of your template. And if you have a bunch of traffic come in with if none match, which no longer match. It's essentially like blowing the cache in every browser out there. So those of you with a large-scale deployment or an app that's designed for this will want to avoid that. Another thing that did we add that? Another thing that's affects the representation of your resources are your assets. So asset pipeline, you're going to end up with a bunch of URLs with digests in them. And when those digests change, or when the assets you reference change, you really want the representation to be seen as different also, particularly when you're doing something like changing the DOM of a rendered page, and then you've got some JavaScript that acts on it. You're going to get your JavaScript, but then you're going to have your browser is going to be like, well, I've got the e tag for this page, it checked out, so I'm going to show the old page, which has like a stale DOM, which might be missing something or might have something it's not supposed to. So you can end up in a situation where you kind of got a janky page until somebody does a hard refresh, or just does a refresh, I suppose. And that's the kind of thing that most people on the web are used to doing that. It's like, oh, things seem messed up, I'll reload, and it'll work. So it's the kind of thing that like might be broken but you don't hear about, or nobody would think to like write in about unless you're in some situation where it actually caused a more major problem. Otherwise, it would just seem innocuous. So that's another thing, kind of on that march toward making things like Russian doll caching end to end just work and just work easily. Like it's something that we had to kind of hack into Basecamp and just be a pain in the butt to do in every app, and it's just a lot easier to include that by default.
All right. Anything else on the list? Should we take some questions?
I keep mentally coming back to a couple of other things that aren't Rails 4.2 at all. They're still Rails 4.1. And we have a span of apps with like different Rails versions, and when I think about like what's new, it's what's new mentally to me, and I mean I can kind of guess that might be what's mentally new to everybody else too, if you're not already on 4.1, or if you haven't upgraded your app to take advantage of all the new stuff in 4.1. The things that still feel new to me are like Actionpack variants, the idea of being able to render phone templates separately from tablet. Hey kids, what's up? Yo. It's just changed the way that we work on Basecamp, changed the way our designers work, having the freedom to represent parts of an application, the representation of those resources completely differently. And it's not to say we don't create like full separate kind of vertical apps for each variant, but having those variants available makes it really easy to kind of pick and choose, like this spot needs something mobile specific, or vice versa. If you do mobile first, you can do mobile as your default variant, and then you can introduce a variant for something like for desktop view, or for an iPad view, or whatever. And the other big one that still gets me is Spring. Spring is the new kind of like arg Spring for me a lot of the times. But that's only when I notice that it surprised me somehow. Then all the other times, it reminds me like back in the day there's like a persistent Perl thing where like you'd use that as your shebang, and it would boot up Perl for you and fork it, and it's like considered like this horrible hack, and it is, but it's also okay. When I go to run rake and it's instantaneous, like it's great. When I go to run tests and they start running immediately, that's great. And that's the kind of development experience that we want to have. And ideally, Rails and Ruby would be fast enough. It's not even necessarily speed; it's just choosing how to do things to optimize for things like boot time, so that when we want to do something like start running tests immediately, that can happen, and we could get rid of Spring at that time. But in the meantime, this handful of things between Rails 4.1 and 4.2 are the things that really make just development fun. Remove a lot of the boilerplate kind of pain in the ass stuff, less waiting, less tapping around, less writing the same stuff again, and there's something just really nice about that's that's like a Rails focus. Like starting your being able to run rake and have it start quickly that was worth developing a forking background process. Cool.
I think that's everything.
All right. Well, I know that there's a little bit of delay between what we're seeing on the Hangout and what people are seeing who are watching. So I'm going to wait a second, but if you in the audience have questions, we've got about 15 minutes before I promised everybody we'd be done. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll make sure they get asked before we wrap up.
Sorry, go ahead.
If anybody's looking for their first Rails pull request, documentation always needs love. And it's not a bad pull request. Half of my pull requests are documentation changes. Because sometimes people will update something in Rails and then will forget to fix the documentation because it's documented elsewhere, not necessarily right above that method. And you'll end up in situations where you're just like, this doesn't work the way it says that it works. And sometimes the documentation is just wrong. And it's really great when people fix it, and sometimes there's sentences don't make sense because you just wrote it when you were tired and you're like, I'm done with this method and this is my documentation. And then sometimes it's nice when somebody comes along and fixes it. I'm a little sick, so yeah.
So was that an invitation to help or a confession? I heard that guilty laugh, Jeremy.
I love reading.
I never write bad documentation, ever.
And I do. Sometimes I realize I think that's something that's a little bit of hubris or a common conceit among people who program, because once you've imagined, you've got in your mental space, what needs to happen, kind of how everything fits together, and then you get it all out in code, and this is going to execute, and by the time that you're finished, your brain is all bent around being able to kind of execute your mental model, the computer's mental model, and it's easy to think well, it just kind of makes sense, versus then me coming back to my own code. I mean, this is such a standard, everybody does this thing. I have to spend more than 10 seconds glancing at this to understand, what was my mental state? I'm needing to, I serialize my mental state into a format I don't understand. And now I need to read this and somehow, deserialize it, and I'm getting errors. Did I do it wrong? And, whatever. And documentation is a great way of, in the first place, reading the documentation certainly helps. But reminding yourself to write it and be disciplined about how to give hints or cues to your future self about the intent behind it, the other kind of unstated assumptions behind that code. And then as you're writing the documentation, you're realizing this doesn't make sense. And reading the code, what does that method even mean? I don't know. What is that name? It was just that name was just enough for them to to get it done, because the concept mattered, the name didn't. You're trying to document something and tell something to your future self, the name totally matters. And all those details of can I ingest this now, versus oh god, I need to configure myself to run this program mentally now.
Mm-hmm.
Documentation, well, if you see good documentation, it's often a sign that the code makes sense. Whereas the converse is not true. The code may be great, but you don't know until you mentally simulate it and kind of mentally document it yourself, which is a lot of work.
All right. Well, we're not getting any questions in the chat, so you must have done a good job. I do want to know, are there other ways that people can contribute or test out Rails 4.2 to make sure that it's ready or readier for prime time?
So you can, once you upgrade your app, if you see problems with something, when reporting a bug, it's so much more likely that someone is going to either fix it or help you fix it if you send with it a test script. So in the guides you'll find test scripts for Active Record and others. I don't know, there's other ones, but I've never used any of the other ones. Active Record is one of the ones that has like the biggest number of questions that like we need a test script for. So you just change all the things you need to do, make your tables, and it just runs in SQLite like in memory, and then just like runs the test you wrote so that we can see like what's breaking and then tell you if it's expected behavior or not. Documentation, and there's like just testing out like some of the new features, or that like bug times. One bug will get fixed, but it will break something else, or it will like show that there actually was a deeper bug, and the bug that was fixed like actually wasn't the real problem. And getting that information from users, because like sometimes a lot of people who work on Rails aren't necessarily creating new applications every day. So there was actually one time that I was using the Rails on master, and I couldn't actually start the application, and it was because a gem needed to be, the ARL gem wasn't up to, like, in the Rails gem, you can't link in the gem spec to gems that aren't released for security reasons. And so because of that, I actually needed to add the ARL gem with the GitHub repo to my gem file because I was using master. That's not something that would happen in 4.2, but just like stuff like that, like constantly being up to date helps being able to test Rails 4.2 as well. Like if you're on 3.2, you're not going to be able to like test Rails 4.2 with your application right away. So if you have like a little dummy application, like I have one that I use for testing SQL statements, I can use, like, that's not an important application to me, so I can just upgrade that anytime I want and just test out like minor things. So
yeah, I like the general feel of like if you see something, say something. I've been at conferences and talking to people, and they're like, oh, you know, I ran into something with something in my app or whatever, and I worked around it, or I got down to the bottom of it, and I had to do this crazy hack to get around it. And it's like, you know, it's not like you're working with, you know, IBM or something. There's like, it's not or Oracle where you like found a bug in the database, and you're like, I don't even want to deal with talking to them. I'm just like I'm gonna work around that or not use that feature. But just make an issue on GitHub. Just say anything, say something that you ran into something. We have folks who are like incredibly responsive and on top of all new issues. Just fucking fantastic. Raphael is like insane, like aware of everything that's going on, everything new. Like people are paying attention, and they're all volunteers, and you could be one of those people. And all it takes is trying the new gem, seeing what breaks. You can't figure it out in 5 minutes, say something, and people are there to help. Another big one I've noticed helped us internally is after doing an upgrade, say you hold off on it for a little while because like it's gonna take some days to do, and be sure that everything works properly before rolling out to production. And when you're done with that, if you're running continuous integration, try adding a CI build that all it does is updates your gem file to the newest version of Rails. And just leave that running and let it run until it breaks, because at some point it will. And it'll often be when Rails introduced, or with like this case where the arrow dependency broke because we actually needed a Git dependency, or we switched to a Git dependency. And in cases like that, well, you could turn it off and it got some value in the meantime, but it'd be really cool if you could keep it running as a branch and add the Git dependencies. Basically just keep your app green on the latest Rails. So when the Rails change drops that causes your app to fail, then we've got lots of canaries in the coal mine telling us either Rails has a new bug, there's a regression, or this is a new change, an intentional change to Rails that breaks your app. And we need to know that too, because in any major release, we're not out to break apps. Like your app you shouldn't have failing tests. the most you should get are deprecation warnings if there's an intentional major change that's going to happen in the following release. The other case would be is if you upgraded to a major release and you still have deprecation warnings, then if you have CI running on the master branch or whatever the next stable branch, those deprecated features may be removed, which will break your app. So those are also, and it's a great way to keep your app healthy and lively and ready for the next thing, rather than letting that all add up and pile up as like, oh, well, we'll probably upgrade later, but we'll set aside time for it. Instead, your app will always be ready to go.
Very nice. One other thing that I wanted to ask about, Eileen mentioned that she mostly works on Active Record. Jeremy, what areas do you tend to focus on, or are you just kind of all over all the parts of Rails?
Kind of all over. As it's probably been 2, maybe 3 years now since I've been regularly, like, that's my hobby, like spend time working on Rails. I hang out around Rails, like I review pull requests. I write new features sometimes, but it's been long enough that it's not, there's not like a focus point. The things that I appreciate about Rails have changed over the years to some of the things I was talking about earlier, of the adequate things. Like, I really like that there are people who are working in that kind of adequate umbrella of improving Rails itself as a means to improve everybody's lives. And it's not changing the way Rails works. It's not changing the human interface of Rails. It's improving what's already there. And the development experience, like the human interface that is there, often boils down to little things like config4 was extracted from our apps, and recognizing like a simple thing, like it doesn't need to be a big deal. Like, we'd like to share with people, but it's almost too small to say something about. Like, if you look at the implementation, I think it's literally a one-liner, but it's just that it's there, and that it's there is important, and it's worth valuing, and it's worth turning into a feature in a release of software that a bunch of people use. Similarly with the other development improvements, it's something that's been more of a pain in maintenance and bugs and working against the grain of how Ruby works. So you generally prefer, like, go with the flow with Ruby, and constant reloading development mode is easily the #1 10-year-old pain in the butt. Ruby doesn't support it. Is kind of like anti-it to a certain degree, thinking of it as like this hack, but ultimately Rails and Ruby really owe much of their success to that one hack. Mm-hmm. It's like, you can have your web browser open, you don't have to be restarting things, you don't have to be waiting, like your app is alive right there in front of you. And there are a lot of other ways to do that Ruby could do, but we've been stuck in Ruby did it, or Ruby provided enough to make it possible. This is Yehuda's idea. Like, Ruby made it possible. It didn't make it easy. It doesn't even make it pretty. I mean, it's nasty, it's hard, and it's ugly, and it has always been that way, but it's always done just enough, and it's only something that people use in development mode, so it's kind of a funkiness that's acceptable. But it would be awesome and wonderful if people worked on that in Ruby itself. If there was some first-class support for dependency reloading, for essentially like a class loader, that you could remove constants, that you could add constants back, and it would all work, that entire subsystem of Rails could go away, and the world would be a better place.
So one last question, and that is, and I have to say, project maintainers and committers hate this question, but do you know when we can expect to see Rails 4.2 final, or gold master, or whatever you want to call it?
Stop finding regressions.
Real soon now, right?
Yeah, theoretically.
Yeah. You just released beta 4.
Yeah. 3 wouldn't have. It would have been 3 if there wasn't the security drop, but.
So we've actually set internal milestones and dates for all Rails releases now, and have for quite some time. And we had one set. It was October something for RC1, which turned out to be Beta 4, and now I go in the campfire room to see what the new date for RC1 is, and it is when pigs fly. Please help make it happen. So that's the equivalent of real soon now, when we have an outstanding list of blocker bugs. They're marked with a milestone in GitHub issues. So if anybody's interested in pitching in, if you go to the 420 milestone in GitHub issues, that's just the blockers, things that need to be resolved. So there's probably a way you can help, or shed some light on some of the bugs.
Yeah, I always forget about that, the 4.2 milestone. It's a good place to go. Some of them can be a little bit hairy, but they're all important things that need to get fixed. So as soon as those are fixed, we can release RC1. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, here's hoping. Thanks for coming, guys. I guess I should say people, but thanks for coming, folks. And thanks for coming, audience. I hope this helped. I hope we get some ideas of what we can be doing with Rails 4.2, and yeah, the preview is just a lot of fun, and I just want you guys to pass along a big thank you to the rest of the Rails contributors, and let them know that we appreciate them making our lives better.
Will do.
Oh.
All right. I'm going to push the big red button.
See y'all.